The moment Genevieve stepped off the plane from Chicago, she already knew something was wrong. It wasn't intuition exactly. It wasn't the kind of knowing that arrives with a cold shiver or a voice whispering warnings. It was quieter than that. It was the way her husband, Colton, had been answering her calls all week with a 2-second delay before picking up. The way his texts had gotten shorter, crisper, like someone typing with one hand while doing something else with the other. She'd been in Chicago for 6 days. A corporate audit assignment, the kind her firm sent her on twice a year. The kind Colton used to complain meant he had to eat dinner alone and reminded him why he'd never wanted to marry a woman who was more married to her spreadsheets than to him. He'd said that once, laughing, like it was a joke. She'd laughed too. She wasn't laughing now, standing at baggage claim in Dallas-Fort Worth, watching the carousel go around and around while she scrolled back through 5 days of text messages and wondered when exactly her husband had started answering okay to everything. "How's everything at home?" "Okay." Lena called. "Did you pick her up from practice?" "Okay. I'll be back Friday, not Thursday. Is that okay?" "Okay." Their daughter, Lena, was 12. She was staying with Genevieve's mother, Ruth, for the week. That had been arranged before Genevieve even booked the flight, because Colton had told her he had back-to-back client dinners and couldn't guarantee he'd be home before 9 every night. Ruth lived 20 minutes away and adored Lena, so it wasn't a hardship. It was just the kind of quiet logistics that a marriage of 11 years generates automatically, the kind where you stop asking why and just start arranging. Genevieve grabbed her suitcase off the belt, wheeled it toward the exit, and called Colton. It rang 4 times. "Hey." His voice was slightly breathless, slightly off. "Hey, I just landed. Are you home?" A pause. Not long, maybe 1 second. But she'd been married to this man for 11 years, and she knew his pauses the way she knew the sound of his car pulling into the driveway. "No, I'm still out. Client thing ran long. Just grab an Uber, babe. I'll make it up to you tonight. Just grab an Uber." She had a perfectly good car in the long-term parking lot 3 minutes from where she was standing. She'd taken an Uber to the airport 6 days ago because Colton had offered to drive her and then canceled at the last minute. "Client emergency," he'd said. So she'd left her car at home and Ubered to DFW at 6 in the morning, which meant she had no car here. "Colton, I don't have my car, remember? I left it at—" Right. Sorry. Just grab a rideshare. It's like $20. She stood still for a moment in the middle of the terminal while people flowed around her like water around a stone. A couple hurried past pulling matching luggage. A man in a business suit talked into his earpiece. Somewhere to her left, a kid was crying. "I'll Venmo you. 11 years. A mortgage. A daughter. A dog named Biscuit, who slept on Colton's side of the bed because Colton had trained him wrong and never fixed it, and he was going to Venmo her $20. She opened the Uber app, then closed it. She thought about her mother's house, where Lena was. Her mother lived near the Galleria, which was not far from the restaurant district where Colton usually took clients. The steakhouses, the wine bars, the places with leather booths and dim lighting, and $60 entrees that the company expensed. She thought about the route. She thought about the restaurant Colton had mentioned offhand 2 weeks ago. Something about taking the Harmon account team somewhere fancy to close the deal. She booked an Uber. She gave it her mother's address. Then she sat in the back seat and stared out the window and tried to talk herself down from whatever ledge she was standing on. She almost made it. They were passing through Uptown, 20 minutes from her mother's house, when she saw Colton's car. She knew that car the way she knew her own reflection. A black Audi A6, the one she'd pushed for because the lease deal was better, the one with the small dent on the rear passenger side that Colton had gotten in a parking garage and never gotten fixed because he said it would work itself out. It wouldn't work itself out. She'd known that for 2 years. She'd stopped saying it. The car was parked outside Aurelio's, which was a restaurant she and Colton had been to exactly twice. Once for their 9th anniversary. Once for a birthday dinner with friends. It was the kind of place with candles on every table and a maitre d' who remembered your name. "Can you pull over for a second?" she said. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror but didn't say anything. He pulled to the curb half a block down. Genevieve sat there. She thought about calling Colton again. She thought about walking in. She thought about getting back on the highway and going to her mother's house and picking up her daughter and pretending the next 6 hours hadn't happened. Instead, she got out of the car. She told the driver she'd tip him for the wait. He nodded like he'd done this before. The entrance to Aurelio's had a small vestibule with a coat check and a hostess stand, and the main dining room was visible through a set of glass-paneled double doors. Genevieve did not go through the double doors. She stood at the edge of the vestibule, just inside the entrance, in the shadow of the coat check where no one was sitting because it was April and nobody needed a coat. She found him in 40 seconds. Colton was at a corner table, the one that Genevieve privately thought of as the couple's table, because it was tucked away from the main room, lit by 2 candles instead of 1, with a kind of privacy that felt deliberately engineered. He was wearing the blue button-down she'd given him for Christmas. His hair was slightly different, not cut differently, just styled, the way he only styled it when he was trying to impress someone. Across from him was a woman Genevieve had never seen before. She was perhaps 35, dark hair, blown out smooth, a red dress that suggested she'd planned this. She was laughing at something Colton had just said, and Colton was leaning forward with his elbows on the table the way he leaned when he was really engaged with someone, the way Genevieve hadn't seen him lean toward her in. She couldn't say how long. She'd stopped noticing when it stopped. Colton reached across the table and put his hand over the woman's hand. The woman in the red dress turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. Genevieve stood there and watched this for probably 15 seconds. It felt much longer. The restaurant noise, silverware, low conversation, soft music that was trying very hard not to be heard. All of it receded until she was just standing in a very quiet place watching. Her husband held another woman's hand across a candle table at the restaurant where they'd celebrated 9 years of marriage. Her phone buzzed. She looked down. A Venmo notification. $22 from Colton. The memo said cab fare. She almost laughed. She walked out of the vestibule, back to the sidewalk, back to the car where the driver was waiting, with the kind of patient neutrality that suggested he was, in fact, a professional at this specific thing. She got in. She gave him her mother's address. She sat in the back seat with the $22 Venmo notification open on her phone screen. And she did not cry, and she did not call anyone. And she did not text Colton that she'd seen him. She just thought. Genevieve had always been a thinker rather than a reactor. It was one of the things Colton used to say he loved about her, early on. "You're so calm," he'd say, like it was a compliment. Later it became, "You're so cold." Later still, he just stopped saying much of either. The distance between calm and cold was apparently a road they'd traveled without her noticing the mile markers. She'd grown up watching her father make impulsive decisions. Quit jobs, blew up relationships, moved the family 3 times before Genevieve was 10. Her mother, Ruth, had spent 30 years being the steady one, the planner, the person who quietly kept everything running, while Genevieve's father careened from one dramatic gesture to the next. Ruth had finally left him when Genevieve was in college. She'd done it without a scene, without screaming, without any of the explosive confrontations Genevieve had braced for. She'd simply prepared, and then she'd left. Genevieve had watched that and filed it somewhere deep. She spent the Uber ride to her mother's house doing math in her head. Their joint accounts had roughly $40,000 in them, built up over years of Genevieve's careful, saving against Colton's more casual relationship with their finances. The house had equity they'd bought in 2016, and the neighborhood had appreciated considerably. Colton's income as a regional sales director was good, but he spent generously. And Genevieve had always been the one tracking where everything went. She also had a separate account that Colton didn't know about. Not a secret in a sinister sense, she just never mentioned it. And he'd never asked. It held 3 years of bonuses carefully set aside. She'd started it after a conversation with her mother, years ago, in which Ruth had said the one thing she wished she'd done differently was to never let herself become entirely financially dependent on a man whose judgment she wasn't certain of. Genevieve had thought she was certain of Colton's judgment. She wasn't certain anymore. Her mother's house was a neat brick Tudor in the kind of neighborhood where people still raked their own leaves. Ruth opened the door before Genevieve reached the porch. She must have seen the car pull up, and stood there with the look she always had, the one that somehow combined warmth with an uncanny ability to read exactly what was happening. "You look tired," Ruth said. "I am," Genevieve said. Lena came thundering down the stairs in socks, crashed into Genevieve at full speed, and announced that Grandma Ruth had taught her to make biscuits from scratch, and they were not as good as the kind from the can, but they were technically more impressive. Genevieve held her daughter and pressed her face into the top of Lena's hair and breathed in the smell of her shampoo, and for just that moment she was not doing math or holding herself together or deciding anything. She was just a mother holding her kid. She stayed for dinner. Ruth did not ask about Colton. Ruth had a talent for not asking about things until the right moment, which was another thing Genevieve had spent a lifetime learning from. After Lena went to bed, Genevieve sat at her mother's kitchen table and told her everything. Not emotionally, factually, in the way she processed most things, working through the sequence of events the way she'd work through an audit discrepancy. Chicago, the calls, the Uber, the parking lot, Aurelio's, the red dress, the hand, the Venmo notification with the heart emoji. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Genevieve finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I don't know yet," Genevieve said. "But I'm not going to do anything I can't undo before I'm ready." Ruth nodded. She got up and made tea, and they sat there until almost midnight and talked about other things. Genevieve did not go home that night. She texted Colton that she was staying at her mother's because she was exhausted from the trip and would see him tomorrow. He texted back, "No problem. Sleep well," in under 10 seconds, which told her he was still at the restaurant, or wherever the evening had gone after the restaurant, and was relieved not to have to come home. She noted that, too. Over the next 3 weeks, Genevieve became very busy. Not visibly busy. Not in any way Colton would have noticed, because Colton was not particularly attentive to her schedule. She kept the same hours, made the same dinners when it was her night to cook, asked about his days with the same measured interest she'd maintained for the last several years of a marriage that she was now re-examining with fresh eyes and a very different set of questions. She found a lawyer, a woman named Dorothea Kwan, whose office was 40 minutes from their neighborhood and who had a reputation, a colleague told her discreetly, for being extraordinarily thorough and remarkably hard to unsettle. Genevieve liked her immediately. They met twice over lunch in a restaurant far enough from Colton's office that she didn't worry about being seen. Dorothea walked her through everything: asset documentation, financial disclosures, custody frameworks. Primary residential custody for Lena was not in doubt, but the structure mattered. She told Genevieve to document what she could, to make no sudden movements, to give Colton no indication that anything was different. "The best position to negotiate from," Dorothea said, "is one where the other party doesn't know you're negotiating." Genevieve had always respected people who stated obvious truths with complete confidence. It suggested they knew their field. She also, quietly, moved the money that was already hers. The separate account, 3 years of bonuses. She moved it to a new account at a different institution, tightened the beneficiaries, ensured it was not in any joint structure that could be complicated. Dorothea said this was prudent. Genevieve already knew it was prudent, but it helped to have it confirmed. She told her mother, and only her. She did not tell her friends. Her friends were couple friends, the kind she and Colton had accumulated together, which meant they were really nobody's friends when a marriage ended. She did not tell her sister in Phoenix, not yet. She did not tell Lena, who was 12 and perceptive, and already asking questions like, "Why does Dad always have his phone face down at dinner?" that Genevieve answered carefully and vaguely, the way you answer a 12-year-old who deserves better than a lie but doesn't need the whole truth yet. She observed Colton. She did it the way she did an audit, without revealing what she was looking for, without showing her hand, collecting data points, and organizing them into a picture that she could look at clearly when she was ready. What she saw, once she was really looking, was a man who had been living 2 lives so casually that he'd long since stopped being careful. The way he angled his phone, the evenings that ran late, the weekend he said he had a work retreat in Austin, and she Googled the hotel and found it was a boutique property that seated 60 people for dinner rather than the conference facility he'd described. She didn't confront him. She documented it. She gave the documentation to Dorothea. She also saw, for the first time with real clarity, what had been happening to her marriage for longer than she'd admitted. The distance had been building for years. She'd attributed it to stress, to the natural drift of a long marriage, to the fact that they were both busy and Lena required so much of them. She'd been so busy being the responsible one, the steady one, the person who paid the bills and arranged the childcare and kept the machine running, that she'd mistaken endurance for contentment. She had been so focused on holding everything together that she'd never stopped to ask whether what she was holding together was worth holding. She thought about the woman in the red dress. She tried to feel jealous and couldn't quite locate it. Or maybe what she found in its place was something more honest, which was grief. Not grief for Colton specifically. Grief for the version of her marriage she'd believed in, for the 11 years she'd spent on something that had apparently been quietly hollowing out from the inside without her permission. She let herself feel that grief alone at night in the guest room she'd started using because she told Colton her sleep had been disrupted in Chicago and she didn't want to wake him. He hadn't argued. He hadn't even seemed to notice. 6 weeks after she stood in that vestibule and watched her husband hold another woman's hand across a candlelit table, Genevieve was ready. She did not stage a dramatic confrontation. She'd thought about it, imagined the moment where she laid every piece of evidence on the kitchen counter and watched Colton's face go through its stages. Part of her wanted that. Part of her wanted to see him understand that she'd known, that she'd been watching, that every dinner and every good night and every okay text had been cataloged by a woman who was already 3 steps ahead of him. But she thought about her mother. She thought about her father's dramatic gestures and what they had actually produced. She thought about Dorothea's advice about negotiating from an undetected position. She served Colton the papers on a Tuesday morning through Dorothea's process server, while Colton was eating cereal at the kitchen counter and Genevieve was sitting at the table with her coffee and her work laptop, going through her emails, and Lena was at school. He stared at the papers for a very long time. Then he looked at her. "You're serious," he said. "Not a question. More like something arriving." "Yes," she said. She sounded like herself. Calm. The good kind. "Genevieve, I started again. We should talk about this." "I can explain." "You don't need to explain," she said. "I was in Dallas. I saw your car outside Aurelio's. I went in." She watched his face. "I didn't make a scene. I didn't call you. I went to my mother's house." The color changed in his face. Something collapsed and rearranged. "You've known for 6 weeks," he said. "Yes." He sat down on the bar stool like the air had gone out of him. Genevieve closed her laptop and stood up. She was already dressed for work. She'd timed this deliberately. She had a meeting at 9, which meant she had a reason to leave, which meant the conversation would have a natural end. "Dorothea's firm will be in contact about scheduling. I'd like this to be civil for Lena." She picked up her bag. "I'll be back at 7. Lena's at your mother's tonight, so it's fine if you need the evening." She walked to the door. "Genevieve." His voice was different now, stripped of the easy assurance she'd once found so attractive. "I'm sorry." She paused at the door. She thought about Aurelio's. She thought about the heart emoji Venmo notification. She thought about 6 years of okay texts and face-down phones, and a marriage that had been silently carved out from underneath her, while she was busy keeping everything running. "I know," she said. She did not say it warmly. She did not say it coldly. She said it the way you state a fact that no longer requires your emotional involvement. She left. The divorce took 8 months, which was faster than Dorothea had projected. Colton did not fight particularly hard, which Genevieve suspected was partly guilt, and partly the fact that Dorothea was extraordinarily thorough, and he'd retained a lawyer who wasn't. The house was sold. The equity was divided fairly, which was all Genevieve had wanted. Primary residential custody of Lena was settled with Colton taking every other weekend and alternating holidays, which was what Lena's schedule and school commitments supported. Colton did not argue about the financial disclosures. He didn't try to complicate the accounts. Genevieve thought sometimes that he was relieved. That a man who had been living 2 lives for, she still didn't know exactly how long, might feel some version of release when one of them ended. She didn't ask. It didn't matter. The woman in the red dress did not last. Genevieve heard this from Colton's sister, Brenda, who called once to apologize on behalf of the family in a roundabout way and mentioned, seemingly without thinking, that Colton was back to being on his own. Genevieve thanked her for calling and said nothing in response to this information. The account Colton didn't know about held 14 months of expenses. It held Genevieve and Lena through the transition. The gap between selling the house and finding the right apartment, the school supplies, and the new bedroom furniture, and the way Lena went through a month of being quieter than usual, before she started asking to have her friends over again, which was when Genevieve knew they were going to be fine. Ruth came to dinner every Sunday. It became a ritual, without anyone deciding it would be. She'd arrive at 4. She and Lena would cook something, while Genevieve worked for another hour. And then they'd eat at the table that Genevieve had bought herself, and that fit exactly right in the dining room of an apartment she'd chosen entirely on her own terms. On one of these Sundays, Ruth said something that Genevieve wrote down afterward on the notepad she kept by the kitchen counter. "The women who come out the other side of something like this," her mother said, "are the ones who understood that their stability was never really about him to begin with. Genevieve had thought about that for a long time. She thought it was true, and she also thought it was the kind of truth that you couldn't fully understand until you'd already proven it to yourself. You couldn't borrow it from someone else's experience. You had to earn it. Lena was 13 now, and making biscuits from scratch, with a confidence that had improved significantly since the first attempt. She asked good questions and laughed easily and was, Genevieve thought, with the particular fierceness of a mother who has come through something. Exactly herself, in all the ways that mattered. And Genevieve, standing at her own kitchen counter on a Sunday evening, while her daughter and her mother made noise in the background, and the apartment smelled like butter and flour and something warm, was exactly herself, too. For the first time in a long while, she was quite sure of it.